I don't know what happened there. My internet is playing up today, so yes. So we'll have to see how long we can stay with this. But okay, I'm just going to go back a little ways. So hopefully you can pick this up if you just suddenly lost me there. So, vision therapy, vestibular therapy, exertion therapy, rest, etc. Avoid stimulation, eat well, fluids, avoid strenuous exercise, etc., etc. So this can be a very slow process to recovery, and I treat quite a lot of it, and even with treatment, it can be a slow healing. The brain has to heal. I'm going to talk about what actually happens pathophysiologically in a second. But post-concussion syndrome actually occurs in 1 in 5. It's much more common than is realized. The symptoms: headaches, dizziness, vertigo, fatigue, memory issues, concentration issues, insomnia, restlessness, irritability, apathy, depression, anxiety, changes, small changes in personality, and a very strong sensitivity to sound and light, which can trigger kind of a lockdown. This is incredibly common and extremely hard to treat, even with lots of vestibular therapy, lots of physio, and giving it time to heal. But this is where we can come in. This is really important. This is our place that's so important because, number one, in diagnosis, in going, and I do this a lot, actually you have a concussion in there because you can feel it. And that is what's causing this problem. They'll say, well, hang on. Oh, no. Oh, yes. Sorry. I had a terrible hit to my head. And then, oh, those headaches slowly started coming on actually a month after that. This is our role, is to be able to evaluate whether there is a because I can't see a better way than us actually being able to feel. So what does it feel like? What does concussion feel like? And this is the nitty-gritty bit now. What does it actually feel like? Well, it's, okay, number one, you can have direct damage, trauma, compression, lack of motility in the cranial bones that are affected, the frontal bone, you know, the greater vena, the sphenoid, the parietal, etc., whatever, occiput. You know, the bone is locked, simply, and there's a particular force pattern which goes through that bone, okay? Now, you've got the whiplash, the shunting, which is very, very important. So what you tend to have is both the dural membrane, the RTM, and the cerebrospinal fluid fluctuation shut down. They both lock down. For example, the cerebrospinal fluid fluctuation through the ventricles, the cisternae, and the waterbeds, just, there's no motion, there's no fluidity in there. The whole thing has this brittle, locked quality. If you don't have cerebrospinal fluid fluctuation, or a lot of the restorative processes of the brain, I'll talk about that in a little minute, aren't functioning. It's a problem. You've got the dura, traumatic membranous inertia, the membrane shut, the dural globe and the RTM, the dural, the tent and the falx, and the anterior dural girdle. There's no movement and there's no motility. That has a huge effect, of course, through the venous sinuses. I'll come to that, you know. Then you have actual problems with the central nervous system. You have microvascular problems. Actually, there is inflammation, damage on a microvascular level, often through the subarachnoid space. But actually, it can be a lot deeper as well. So you have vascular trauma, which has an effect on neuronal tissue, of course. So you've got these micro damage effects. And, you know, they can't necessarily be seen unless it's quite severe in traumatic brain injury on any kind of MRI scan. But it's it's there on a very micro level. So you've got all of these 5 elements, as it were, that you'd like to evaluate, are all involved. So, and what you can feel also sometimes, there is the shunting action of the brain within the dural membrane literally locks down the water beds that it sits on. Chum, the whole brain locks down. It doesn't float anymore. Okay, so within this whole process, you've got a lack of motility of the central nervous system in parts or whole, the dural system locked down, the bony system and the cerebrospinal fluid system all locked down. Often there can be a fall that can affect the spine. We have to evaluate the spine. Old whiplash patterns, very, very important. HPA shock, adrenal shock, the actual shock that's retained in the physiology from the trauma itself gets locked into this pattern. And so let's just talk about a couple of the kind of interesting tissues here. So you've got this idea, it's being researched much more recently. Some of these more recent research things are quite interesting about astrocytes and the way that they can act to sense subtle changes in neural activity, and they control the composition of the extracellular space. And through that, they act as support cells. They help with homeostatic mechanisms. For example, neurotransmitter function, extracellular osmolarity, which is to do with the fluid dynamic, which is really important with the cerebrospinal fluid as well. Neurovascular coupling. So homeostasis and water and blood flow are all involved with astrocyte function. Now, this idea of astrogliosis, which happens in traumatic brain injury, including concussions, can actually have effects on the gene expression morphology and the proliferative activity of astrocytes. And another interesting thing, which is really fascinating, is this new research linking gut microbes, the gut biome, how they can exert control on some subsets of astrocytes and affecting their function in regulation of the central nervous system. So that's that whole thing of, certain kids, if they eat something, the whole dural membrane locks down. Why? Well, these astrocytes have these end feet, if you look at a picture of them, which are attached to the pia mater through its kind of coherence with the outer glial membrane. So they're directly attached to the pia, and through the arachnoid, the connective tissue, through the subarachnoid space, the vascularity, to the dura, and then to the bone. So this has been called, and is starting to be called, this pia-glial interface. And this glial function is vital in post-concussive syndromes because the traumatic membranous inertia, the lack of fluidity, etc., and the microvascular changes actually have an effect on neuronal activity and function and metabolism, etc., So this is really important. And so our role in freeing up the bones, freeing up the dural membranes, the layers of the dural membranes, allowing the CNS to breathe, allowing the fluctuation of the cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles and the extracellular spaces is absolutely key. And so you can see the kind of thrust of what I'm trying to talk about here. So if the dura locks down, boom, traumatic membranous inertia, you've got the endothelial linings which govern the motion of the venous sinuses have this poor function. And then there's poor function around some of the great sinuses, like, for example, the cavernous sinus, which surrounds the pituitary. Other important areas, like, for example, the basilar sinus, which lies in layers of dura around the clivus, can lock down. That's really important, absolutely, because all the cranial nerves that pass through there. And this rich vascularity through the subarachnoid space can be affected. The subarachnoid space is filled with vascularity and cerebrospinal fluid. Nutrition, neurotransmitters, gets rid of waste. So sleep is affected, shortwave sleep. Shortwave sleep, as I've talked about in previous lectures, has been linked, in its thalamic stimulus, has been linked to this lovely motion of the cerebrospinal fluid is mobilized from the subarachnoid spaces into the ventricles, like a natural CV4 or a CV3. And as it migrates into the ventricle, it acts to cleanse, metabolize the brain matter. It has this movement, it's a natural CV4 process. Beautiful. If that's locked down, and the subarachnoid spaces and the fluids are locked down, and the cisterns, the subarachnoid cisterns, the fluid spaces, the water beds that allow the brain to float, locked down, there's a problem. And look at, if you get a chance, the specific anatomy of the interpeduncular cistern, which lies between the optic chiasma and the pons, and that's really important. There's a beautiful web of venous cisternae, and the cistern also is an interesting one of the lamina terminalis, which sits in a loop just below the lamina terminalis. Now, Sutherland was very clear when he talked about the lamina terminalis being a fulcrum of motion, the fulcrum of motion of the central nervous system. And in traumatic brain injury of whatever kind, if it's vascular from interior or it's force from without, can lock down the free motion of the lamina terminalis as a fulcrum of motion for the CNS as a whole. And if that happens, it literally stops the brain as a whole moving and breathing. And so a way to shift that is to engage with the fluidity in that cistern that loops below the lamina terminalis. Anyway, these are just little ideas of ways in and how important this subject is, actually. This is because if you can have your vestibular work, which is absolutely vital, actually, as well, working, doing exercising, strengthening these vestibular ocular reflex patterns, really trying to, but I know nothing else that can actually start to access and heal, engage with the micro plasticity, especially in younger people and children, that's available to actually allow these to heal. These are brain injuries, and they're accumulative, and they cause great problems. And this is what I mean about starting to become really precise and allowing ourselves to really feel, where is this trauma? What's going on here? And why is this happening here? And can I access this? Can I allow that to breathe, to float, to function again? And if so, we start to change things. Anyway, that's an introduction to it. And I'll come back maybe sometime soon, maybe in a week or two, talking about why is that baby crying? Anyway, I wish you well. I'm doing a meditation on Saturday night, if that's your kind of thing. Something about some sort of non-dual way, maybe. In the meantime, I wish you very well. And if any of my other lectures, they're all available. Just have a look at them on the